Hello, and welcome to the History of the Germans, episode 198, How Holland Was Lost, part 1, which is also episode 14 of season 10, The Empire in the 15th Century. Today we begin a two-part series about how the Low Countries, modern-day Belgium, Netherlands and Luxembourg, shifted out of the Holy Roman Empire. These lands, with the exception of Flanders, had been part of the empire for hundreds of years, ever since Henry the Fowler acquired Lothringia for East Francia in 925, not by conquest but through diplomacy, as was his way. There are two ways to tell the story of the split away from the empire. One is about the dynastic machinations, the marriages, poisonings and inability to produce male heirs. The other one is about economics and the rising power of the cities. This, the first episode, will look at the dynastic story, the potluck and cunning plans that laid the groundwork for the entity that became known as the Low Countries. Whilst the next one will look at the economic realities that thwarted the ambitions of one of the most remarkable women in late medieval history, Jacqueline of Bavaria, countess of Holland, Seeland and Hainault, and why that was ultimately a good thing. Not for her, not for the empire, but for the people who lived in these lands. But before we start, the usual reminder that this show is advertising free. No frantic pressing of the forward button to evade some cringe-worthy endorsement of products one could at least be skeptical about. Eschewing the corporate mammon may not have been the most efficient way to organize things, but then I'm absolutely overwhelmed by the generosity of so many of you. Generosity not just directed at me, but mostly at your fellow listeners. And this week's special thanks go to Bradley M., Ute of Swabia, Stian R., Rob V., KTB, Radiatore, and Christian, who have gone to historyofthegermans.com/support and have made a contribution. And with that, back to the show. Now, one of my habits when traveling in the lands that had once been part of the Holy Roman Empire is to look out for Imperial Eagles, the signs of the authority of the Empress. I know it's geeky, but then what's a man to do? Going to Belgium, you will see quite a few. On the Grand Place in Brussels, the Town Hall of Antwerp, and the Basilica of the Holy Blood in Bruges. But in the Netherlands, these are much rarer. The statues in Nijmegen proudly features Frederick Barbarossa and Karl IV, and Deventer shows an Imperial Eagle on its flag and coat of arms. But otherwise, very little. It's very much at odds with the medieval political borders, as much of Belgium was the county of Flanders, which belonged to the Kingdom of France, whilst almost the entirety of the modern-day Netherlands had been firmly in the Holy Roman Empire until the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Several Dutch cities played important roles in the medieval empire, hosting kings and emperors. Nijmegen saw the death of Empress Theophano and the birth of Emperor Henry VI. Utrecht was where Henry IV's campaign to have Pope Gregory VII deposed fell apart, and it's also where Henry V died and declared Frederick of Hohenstaufen to be his heir. And one of the locals, William Count of Holland, even became King of the Romans. In other words, this was Imperial heartland well into the time of the Hohenstaufen. It was one of the great stem duchies, the Duchy of Lower Lothringia. Now in this episode we will talk about how in the late 14th and early 15th century the counties and duchies that made up the Low Countries slowly slipped out of the grasp of the emperors. Because saying they were part of the Holy Roman Empire until 1648 is the same as claiming Robbie Williams was still in Take That in 2010. So let's go through the most important of these counties, duchies and principalities. The richest and most powerful of these was the county of Flanders, that contained the economic heart of northern Europe of the period, Bruges, Ghent and the other cloth cities. Flanders, as I said, was part of the Kingdom of France, though a few bits and bobs had stretched across the Scheldt into imperial territory. Then there was the Duchy of Brabant, which was the formal successor to the Duchy of Lower Lothringia. Its most prominent centres were Brussels and Antwerp, and since 1288 it also comprised the Duchy of Limburg. The Duchy of Luxemburg, home to the ruling imperial family of the time, lay to the south of Brabant. Then there were several prince-bishoprics, namely Liège, Utrecht and Cambrai, and there were the three counties, Holland, Seeland and Hainault, united under one umbrella that held the coast from the mouth of the Scheldt all the way to the Frisian Islands. Holland and the Netherlands is often used simultaneously, though Holland is only a province, or more accurately 2 provinces of the Netherlands. That being said, the 3 largest Dutch cities, Amsterdam, Rotterdam and The Hague, are all in Holland. The county of Holland goes back to the 9th century and had been ruled by the same family until 1299. A family that had the incredibly good taste of calling their eldest sons Dirk, counting up all the way to Dirk VIII. And once they shifted their naming preferences to Floris and William, the inevitable happened. Their wives, appalled by the cowardly shift to such common names, refused to produce male offspring, and the counts died out. The county, which in the meantime had added the county of Zeeland and had a vague claim on Friesland, was inherited by the counts of Hainault, or Hainault as it is called in French and English. These 3 counties would become one entity that then passed through the generations. Now in 1345, the second line of counts of Holland died out too. The last count had no children at all. All the family now consisted of was 2 aunts. The younger one, Philippa, was married to Edward III, King of England, whilst the elder one, Margaret, had been married to Ludvik the Bavarian, Holy Roman Emperor, heavily featured in episodes 149 to 156. So, who will win the 3 counties? Given the gap in wealth and resources and the trifling matters of geography and economy, the 3 counties should have gone to the King of England. But that did not happen. Instead, Holland, Zeeland and Hainault went to one of the younger sons of Ludvik the Bavarian. The reasons for that were in part political. When the previous count died in 1345, Edward III had already kicked off the 100 Years' War against France, which focused all his efforts and resources. Crécy was just 1 year later. There was simply not enough bandwidth to send a force to Holland to take control of the counties. Ludvik the Bavarian, on the other hand, did have the bandwidth and the ambition to get hold of these lands for his copious gaggle of sons. When the nobles of Holland asked for Margaret to come up and take possession, he sent her, together with several of his younger sons. They quickly took the levers of control, and when Edward III tried his luck again a few years later, he did not get through. But what would be touted as decisive was not just the swiftness of the military and the political action, but the legal argument. The counties, namely Holland and Zeeland, were subject to the rules of the Holy Roman Empire, and based on these, the counties had become vacant fiefs when the last male ruler had died without issue, which meant it was the emperor's job to appoint a new count, and the most suitable candidates were, surprise, surprise, his sons, specifically 2 of the younger ones, William and Albert. Now this legal structure will matter a lot in a moment, but as for 1345, Ludvik the Bavarian did win the fight over Holland. Though as it happened, he had to pay a huge price for it. If you remember episode 156, it was this award of the counties of Hainault, Holland and Zeeland to his own sons that pushed the princes of the empire into opposition and brought about the candidacy of Emperor Karl IV. This struggle ended with a victory for Karl IV and the loss of the imperial crown for the House of Wittelsbach. A very high price indeed. Fast forward 40 years. The Wittelsbachs are broadly recognized as the lords of the 3 counties. The current title holder is Albert, who had taken over when his brother William succumbed to severe mental illness and spent his remaining 30 years incarcerated and bound on hand and feet. It is then in the year 1385 that one of the most consequential events for the Low Countries is taking place. Around a table in the city of Cambrai sat the representatives of the 3 most significant principalities in the northwestern corner of the empire. Representing Holland, Zeeland and Hainault were Albert and his wife, Margaret of Brieg. Facing him was one of the great winners of the 14th century, Philip, younger son of King John the Good of France, head of the French Regency Council, Duke of Burgundy, and his wife, Margaret, the Countess of Flanders. As his impressive list of titles suggests, Philip was a big deal. He not only de facto controlled France at this point, he was also busy building up his own semi-independent principalities based on his Duchy of Burgundy, and the incredibly wealthy County of Flanders, the inheritance of his wife. Philip was not only incredibly ambitious for himself and the dynasty he was to found, but also someone able to play a very, very long game. And his long game aimed to bring all the lands of Flanders and ultimately all of Lothringia under his control in an attempt to resurrect the ancient kingdom of Lothar, the middle kingdom between France and Germany that had been created in the Treaty of Verdun of 843. Holland, Seeland and Hainault were key to achieving this objective. They were the string of pearls around his county of Flanders. And of the two ways to acquire lands, war or marriage, Philip was not shy of the former, but very much preferred the latter, which meant he was happy to invest one of his daughters, his eldest no less, in an option to gain Holland, Seeland and Hainault. So he offered her as a bride to marry Albert's eldest son and heir, William. That looked like a sensible investment. Marguerite was one of 3 daughters he had at the time, plus he had 2 surviving sons, so Marguerite was a valuable pawn, but not an irreplaceable one. Marrying his son to a prince of the blood was certainly a great honour for Count Albert, but not an unwarranted one. The 100 Years' War was still going on, which meant France and England were both trying to lure Holland into their camp. That meant if Albert rejected Philip, he could have easily made a similar deal with the English. Which is why Albert's wife, Margaret of Brieg, felt emboldened to throw a curved ball. Sure, the Count and Countess would be most honoured to receive the most noble Marguerite into her family as the future Countess. But what would be even more beneficial for both sides would be an even closer alliance, one underpinned by one more marriage, that of Philip's heir, John the Fearless, to their daughter, who for the purposes of maximum confusion was also called Margaret. Basically a double wedding. The heir of Holland marries the eldest daughter of the Duke of Burgundy, and the heir of Burgundy marries the eldest available daughter of the Count of Holland. The historian Bart van Loo wrote that Philip, experienced diplomat that he was, did not say a word and made a movement with his head that lay somewhere between nodding yes and shaking his head no. In 1385, the position of the wife of the heir to Burgundy was one of the major political assets in Europe. Philip had intended to use that as a tool to forge even deeper relations with the French court, for instance a marriage to a French princess. Spending all that firepower on a still quite remote chance of acquiring Holland, Seeland and Hainault at a point of time far out in the future, aka a bet on the Wittelsbachs dying out, well, that was not straightforward. On the other hand, rejecting this offer could mean that Albert turned to the English, giving them another beachhead and open up a new frontier in the 100 Years' War. Into these internal calculations dropped an offer from the third party that sat around this table in Cambrai, Joanna of Braband. As I mentioned, Brabant was the third powerful player in the Low Countries. The dukes were the legal successors of the old dukes of Lower Lothringia. As it happened, the ducal family had come to the end of their line. Joanna had inherited the duchy from her father, but her marriages had failed to produce an heir. In 1385 she had turned 60, and her last husband, the Duke Wenceslas of Luxemburg, had just died. A succession crisis was looming. Moreover, Brabant was allied to France, whilst their next-door neighbour, the Duke of Guelders, was friends with the English. If Albert walked away from the Burgundian alliance and shacked up with the perfidious Albion, then Brabant would be surrounded by enemies and would surely be overrun. So, Joanna threw another pawn into the negotiations. She offered the Duchy of Brabant to Philip's second son, should he agree on the double wedding with the Count of Holland. Now that was a prize Philip of Burgundy believed was worth having. Brabant guaranteed an option on Holland, plus an alliance that kept the English out, done deal. So, on April 12, 1385, these consequential weddings were celebrated over 8 days with 20,000 guests, including Charles VI of France. We mentioned the follow-on wedding of that self-same French king Charles VI to Isabeau of Bavaria, a cousin of Albert, which was also at least partially motivated by this alliance between Burgundy and Holland. All this would have not been much more than a splendid feast that would not have had any material consequences for the counties of Holland, Seeland and Hainault. After all, the groom, Count William, was 20 years old, fit and healthy, a mighty warrior and all that. Little Margaret was only 11 years old at the wedding, but in a few years she would certainly start to have children. And William had a brother, John, who was heading for an episcopal career for which he was utterly unsuited. John got himself elected Prince Bishop of Liège, but avoided to take holy orders, meaning he could at any point return to civil life if that was needed. As I said, Philip of Burgundy, known as the Bold, played a long game, a very long game indeed. When he passed in 1404, Joanna of Braband was still alive and kicking. But 2 years later, as planned, Brabant went to Philip's younger son, and from that point forward was firmly in the Burgundy orbit. Where is the empire in all this? Brabant is, after all, an imperial fief, so how come the Duchess can just willy-nilly pass her lands to whoever she thinks is most suitable? The previous transition, when Joanna inherited the duchy from her father, had happened with the consent of the emperor, Karl IV, since her husband was the emperor's half-brother, Wenceslas, Duke of Luxemburg. In 1385, when Joanna made her offer, her husband was already dead. And there was no emperor at the time, only a king of the Romans, and that king of the Romans was Wenceslas the Lazy, who had little capacity to deal with even issues right on his doorstep. At the time the actual transaction occurred in 1406, the ruler of the empire was Ruprecht of the Palatinate, he of the empty pocket. And Ruprecht must count as one of the empire's least effectual rulers, and hence in no way able to stand up to the wealthy Burgundian dukes. So the Burgundians got away with this, and the Duchy of Brabant came under Burgundian control. However, not under the direct control of Philip's eldest son and successor, but under that of his younger son, Anthony. Philip's successor as Duke of Burgundy and Count of Flanders was John the Fearless, he of the disastrous attack at the Battle of Nicopol, episode 168. Whilst his father was a bold but calculating risk-taker, John was outright reckless. When his father died, the regency of France, and hence the access to the French treasury, fell into the hands of the mad king's brother, Louis of Orleans. That so irritated John the Fearless that he, in 1407, had Louis of Orleans murdered, in the open, on the streets of Paris. The net result was a civil war between the family and supporters of the dead Duke of Orleans, led by the psychopathically cruel Count Bernard of Armagnac. And this civil war was only briefly interrupted to give the English a chance to comprehensively rout the French at Agincourt in 1415, but even such a comprehensive defeat did not stop the Armagnacs and the Burgundians to go at each other with utmost brutality. In 1418, the Burgundians under John the Fearless entered Paris and staged a massacre during which the Count of Armagnac was skinned alive, which then led to the second murder John the Fearless is famous for, his own. The Dauphin, i.e. the son and heir of the mad King Charles VI, lured John onto the bridge of Montereau and watched as his henchman planted an axe into the head of the Duke of Burgundy. This murder then pushed the son of John the Fearless, Philip the Good, over the edge. Though he was still a prince of France, he decided to sell the kingdom out to the English. He brought the Queen Isabeau over to his side, which was no mean feat, given she had been closely attached to Louis of Orleans, the man Philip's father had murdered. Together they signed the Treaty of Troyes with King Henry V of England. In this treaty, the mad king agreed to marry his daughter Catherine to King Henry V of England and to make him his heir and successor. To get rid of any potential claims of his own children, the Queen Isabeau declared that her only surviving son, the Dauphin Charles VII, was a bastard and not the son of a king. When 100 years later King Francois of France visited the grave of John the Fearless, he was shown the shattered skull of the great duke. The monk who led him there explained that this was the opening through which the English came into France. But it was not only the route for the English into France, it was also the event that shifted the interests of the Dukes of Burgundy firmly away from the French domestic politics towards the creation of their own kingdom. But before we get to that, we'll have to wind back just a little bit. John the Fearless may have spent most of his blood and treasure on the French Civil War, but he still had kept a wary eye on going-ons in the Low Countries. One key event was the Battle of Ote in 1408. This was a battle between the citizens of Liège and their bishop. And this bishop was none other than John of Bavaria, the brother of Count William VI of Holland, Seeland and Hainault. John, as I mentioned, had managed to get himself elected Prince Bishop of Liège at the rather early age of 17. He had never taken any holy orders, nor did he show even the slightest signs of spiritual aptitude. He had taken the job for the simple reason that the Prince Bishop of Liège controlled a large territory adjacent to his brother's counties, and rather than having it administered by strawmen, as had been the habit so far, the family had decided to place one of their own onto the episcopal throne. And John had an incredible talent to rub up the locals in the wrong way. He kept pushing the citizens of Liège to give up their liberties, which they did not like. So they threw him out. He was admitted back upon promising to stop being such a nuisance, a promise he then ignored, and then etc., etc., etc. This had happened for the first time in 1390 and was repeated several times over in the next 15 years. By 1408, the citizens of Liège really had enough. They now threw him out for good and elected a new bishop. At which point John asked his brother William of Holland and his friend the Duke John the Fearless of Burgundy for help. And they both responded. John the Fearless brought his battle-hardened Burgundian soldiers and lined them up against the city's militia. And this time the Fearless acted much more thoughtful than at the fateful Battle of Nicopol almost 12 years earlier. He held his cavalry forces together and made good use of the infantry and the Scottish archers he had hired. Despite their heroic resistance, the butchers, bakers and candlestick makers of Liège did not stand a chance. The defeat turned into a rout and then into a massacre. The two Johns and William of Holland had decided that they would not take any prisoners, since this was an uprising against the God-given universal order, not a battle between gentlemen. John, the bishop-elect of Liège, returned triumphant into his capital and had all the rebels who had not died in the field hanged or thrown in the river, including the widow of the ringleader. This event gave John the moniker John the Pitiless, which makes it a lot easier to keep him apart from all the other Johns. What it also did was put John the Pitiless deep into debt with the Dukes of Burgundy. From now on, John the Pitiless' loyalty was split between his family and the Burgundians, though that was only a small commitment since most of the loyalty was to himself. Having secured a hold over Liège, John the Fearless' next move was to become a major stepping stone towards the big prize, the control of Brabant, Limburg, Holland, Seeland and Hainault. Because the options that his father had acquired with the double wedding of Cambrai were gradually moving into the money. First up, the marriage between William of Holland and Marguerite of Burgundy had not been particularly fruitful. I could not find any mention that the couple hated each other, but they seem to have preferred other people's company to each other's. William had a soft spot for Dutch girls and therefore preferred to live in Holland. In order to avoid conflict with Margaret, he installed her as governor of his county of Hainault. This arrangement suited both of them and even more the cousins of Burgundy, because distance made procreation hard. They did produce only one surviving child after 16 years of marriage, a daughter by the name of Jacqueline or Jacoba. Jacqueline became a super famous figure in Dutch history due to her great struggle, her 4 marriages, and for being much more than the usual pawn in the game of aristocratic marriages. Jacqueline's father, Count William of Holland, had resigned himself to never having a legitimate male heir, despite an impressive number of illegitimate offspring he had produced so far. At which point the question was whether he would name either his brother, the Bishop-elect John the Pitiless, or any of his Bavarian cousins to become his heir. Or alternatively, he could try to keep his lands in the hands of his daughter. This latter route was definitely a lot harder to push through, and required her to be married to a powerful and well-connected husband, or at least that's what everyone said. William decided nevertheless to go for option 2, passing it all to his beloved Jacqueline, even against all the odds. When he touched the subject with the Emperor Sigismund, he was asked whether really he does not have any suitable brother or cousins. So, William went to the other side for help, and in 1406 he betrothed little Jacqueline to one of the younger sons of King Charles VI, the Mad of France. This boy, John, Duke of Touraine, was then 8 years old. As the future Count of Holland and Hainault, and to protect him from the chaos in Paris, he grew up at the court of his mother-in-law, together with his future bride. They only married in 1415, after the Pope had given his dispensation for the marriage of these 2 very closely related kids. 1415 was an eventful year. It was not only the year the Battle of Agincourt happened, but also the year Louis, the Dauphin of France, died, making the 17-year-old husband of Jacqueline the Dauphin and the future King of France. And as such he had to go to Paris, where the civil war was still raging and the English were coming up the road. The young prince may have learned many things in the relative safety of his mother-in-law's castle, but not enough to survive the rough and tumble of French politics of the time. He barely lasted 2 years before he died, presumably from poisoning. And that was a big blow for Jacqueline and for her father. One moment she was the future Queen of France, her lands protected by the might of the largest kingdom in Europe, and the next she was just a vulnerable widow. Her father and mother had, at least to an extent, planned for this eventuality. Jacqueline had received a very thorough education. The historian Bart van Loo described her as follows, quote, "She was given a solid education, from botany through biblical history, mathematics and languages to the rules of etiquette. As a young girl, she was just as good at analyzing medicinal herbs as she was at knowing the correct way to wear a train. She was bright, inquisitive, not especially pretty, though, at first glance." End quote. She loved riding, hunting, and apparently was no stranger to wearing armor. But still, she was just a mere woman, and as such, she needed a husband, and soon. Into this predicament stepped William's most helpful brother-in-law and friend, John the Fearless of Burgundy. John had a suggestion that was just so appealing, it was almost impossible to resist. John's nephew, the Duke of Braband, who was called again John, was in need of a bride. Now this John's father, Anthony, had died at the Battle of Agincourt, which made John the Fearless the guardian of little John of Brabant. This was, at least from a dynastic perspective, a beautiful match. Bringing together Brabant and Limburg on one hand and Holland, Seeland and Hainault on the other would create a huge contiguous territory stretching from the North Sea coast to Maastricht. That would definitely be a nice chunk for William's beloved daughter and potential grandchildren. Moreover, little John was 14 and no match for Jacqueline, now 17, well educated and forged in the fire of French politics. Now we'll get to John the Fearless considerations in a moment. Before that, we should spare a thought for another key player in this who inherits what game. The Emperor. It's now 1418 and the Emperor is Sigismund, a much more energetic man than his 2 predecessors as we've seen in the last season. And in 1418 he's at the top of his game. He had just closed the Council of Constance that had brought an end to the schism, and he was travelling across Europe as if he were indeed the head of all Christendom, mediating conflicts, even attempting to end the 100 Years' War. and when he saw the chips on the table in the northwestern corner of the empire, the homeland of his dynasty, he bought a seat in the game. He married his niece, Elizabeth of Görlitz, to Anthony, the Duke of Braban and father of young John, and Elizabeth brought with her another big piece of the jigsaw, the Duchy of Luxemburg. What is now in the pot of this mother of all poker games are 3 duchies, Brabant, Limburg and Luxembourg, and 3 counties, Holland, Seeland and Hainault, and given the episcopal power was waning here as it did in the rest of the empire, a few prince-bishoprics as well. Geographically, that is what the Netherlands, Luxembourg and chunks of Belgium are. And all that was to go to little John of Brabant and his bride, the formidable Jacqueline of Holland and Hainault. Which leaves just one question. Why did John the Fearless think this was a good idea? Sure, little John is his nephew and one of his next of kin, but if he ruled such a huge landmass, it was only a question of time before he would challenge his uncle. John the Fearless did not leave notes, so all that I'm saying now is speculation. John the Fearless did know both Jacqueline and John well. And if he knew them well, he must have known that these two would not get on. Jacqueline was smart and headstrong. John was truly gormless. So gormless he wouldn't recognize a gorm if it jumped at him. This marriage was never going to work out, meaning the couple would not have children. And if that was the case, all of John's property, which by law now included Jacqueline's, would go to his closest living male relative, to happen to be, yes, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. Slowly, the option shifts further into the money. The Duke of Burgundy was right. His nephew Brabant was what my son calls an NPC, a non-player character in a video game. Someone who's just there, and then can be moved to wherever the dominant players want him to stand. He may have all the glittering titles and hundreds of noble lords in his retinue, but he had no urge to use them to his advantage. He failed in the one key criteria that Jacqueline's father should have focused on, his ability to protect her inheritance. Maybe William thought he still had a few more years to go, and maybe more children were in him. He was 52 years old, not exactly young, but also not ready for the scrap heap yet. But that is where he ended up. In May 1417, from the most ignominious of reasons, a bite from one of his dogs. The wound got infected, and since Jacqueline's knowledge of medicinal herbs did not yet comprise penicillin, this minor injury became fatal. Once William had moved up to sing with the angels, Jacqueline and John of Brabant had to act swiftly. They had to progress through all of Jacqueline's lands, collect oaths of allegiance, and take hold of the levers of power. Things worked out fine in Hainault, where the couple started out. But when they got into Holland, things were a lot dicier. Holland had been riven between 2 factions, the Cots and the Hooks, for decades. We'll talk more about them next episode, but in a very broad sense, the Cots represented the more progressive, business-oriented city dwellers, while the Hooks represented the feudal, land-based aristocracy. Jacqueline and her father had been aligned with the Hooks, making it hard for them to get into the towns held by the Cots. And remember, there were several other players on that poker table eyeing this mother of all pots. One of them was Jacqueline's uncle, John the Pitiless, the Bishop-elect of Liège. This John immediately shed his belief that the universal order had placed the cities firmly beneath his feet, and he lined up with the Cots, singing the praise of civil liberty. And there's the Emperor Sigismund. Sigismund was not at all happy with all that backroom dealing. He was, after all, the emperor, and as such, was the one who was going to decide what happened to Holland, Seeland and Hainault. Sigismund concluded that the best way forward was to urge John the Pitiless to ditch the episcopal pallium, marry his recently widowed niece Elizabeth of Görlitz, who was also the Duchess of Luxemburg, and get enfeoffed with the 3 counties. That at least looked as if he was in charge here. The next thing he did was to lean on Pope Martin V, the man he had more or less lifted to the papal throne, to block the marriage of Jacqueline and John. Things came to a head when Jacqueline and her hooks pursued John the Pitiless behind the walls of Dordrecht. They put Dordrecht under siege, which, as we know now, in the early 15th century was an arduous task. Jacqueline's husband, Little John of Braband, came to support her, and they could surround the city. Now it was a question of waiting until hunger forced Dordrecht to hand over John the Pitiless, who would then be locked up somewhere safe, and Jacqueline would then be recognized as countess across all her lands. Never got there. After 6 weeks, John and his Brabanters returned home. The city could no longer be fully enveloped, there would never be hunger there, so Jacqueline's allies gave up too. The countess had to sit down to negotiate with her uncle. Mediating the whole process was the invisible hand in the background. Not John the Fearless, who was riding hard and fast towards the bridge of Montereau to get his head kicked in. Instead, it was his son and heir, Philip, soon to be Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. Philip was much more like his grandfather, calculating, patient, and cunning, playing the long game. He looked at the state of affairs and realized that John and Jacqueline's position was hopeless. He convinced John of Brabant that he had to allow John the Pitiless to keep what he had already conquered, and make him governor of the rest of the counties of Holland and Zeeland for the next 5 years. John the Pitiless was also to mate the heir of Jacqueline in case she died without offspring. In return, John the Pitiless gave up his claims on Hainault. And finally, they bought off the enfeoffment by the Emperor Sigismund for 100,000 florins. When that sum wasn't paid, John the Pitiless swapped the claim for an extension of his governorship to 12 years. Jacqueline was already seething that her gormless husband had left her before Dordrecht. The pitiful outcome of the negotiations with John the Pitiless did not help either. And the extension, which was kept concealed from her, added even more fire to the flames. The animosity between husband and wife mounted and mounted as time went by. John's Burgundian advisers kept dripping poison into his ears, setting him against his wife. Because after all, for Burgundy to win, Jacqueline and John must never have children. Jacqueline reacted rather impetuously, and one of these advisers choked on something unhealthy. He was quickly replaced by another one who strengthened his hold over the gormless John with the aid of his beautiful and open-minded wife. Jacqueline found herself more and more ostracized at court. John, the gormless Duke of Brabant, took revenge for the death of his adviser by cutting off Jacqueline's ladies-in-waiting, even going so far as not to serve them any food during the Easter celebrations. Jacqueline was so humiliated, watching her ladies going hungry in full view of everyone. She ran out of the hall, across town, and sought refuge with her mother at an inn. And with that, the marriage was effectively over. Jacqueline fled from Brussels and went to her county of Hainault. She declared to the estates of Hainault that she believed her marriage to the gormless John of Brabant was null and void. They were cousins and as such far too closely related to get married. Though the Pope had revoked his initial ban of the marriage, he had, as of now, not provided a formal dispensation. A case initiated by the Emperor Sigismund was pending in Rome, and as long as that was the case, she was not married. Her cousin of Brabant had no authority here in Hainault or in any of her other counties of Holland and Zeeland. The nobles and churchmen of Hainault listened and performed that same movement we have seen Philip the Bold do, sort of nodding and sort of shaking their heads all at the same time. Whatever this was not good news for Hainault. The most likely outcome of her staying here was war, and war was painful. So they let her know that if she stayed and Brabant and Burgundy invaded, well, they would find very little resistance. Jacqueline needed a new supporter. But who? France was broken. Its mad king was in the hands of Burgundy, and the Dauphin was fighting a war for survival against the English. Emperor Sigismund was opposed to her inheriting in the first place. So, England was the only option, even though King Henry V was an ally of Philip the Good of Burgundy. When she arrived in 1421 at Dover, she was welcomed by the king's younger brother, the dashing Humphrey of Gloucester. Humphrey was exactly the kind of man she liked, she needed. Handsome, warlike, but also interested in art and well educated. He kept a huge library by the standards of the time, which he left to the University of Oxford. Fans of Harry Potter will immediately recognize the Duke Humphrey Library as Hermione's favourite haunt. Much has been made of the passion Jacqueline had allegedly felt for Humphrey. But there's no denying that he was also the perfect candidate for the job. A younger brother of a king, which should give him access to military resources and cash, and a desire to own lands in his own right, not just on behalf of the crown. So in September 1422, Jacqueline, Countess of Holland, Seeland and Hainault, married Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, his first and her third marriage, with the added frisson that in the minds of much of Europe Jacqueline was still married to John of Brabant. A scandal of epic proportions, but taking place in a period of dramatic upheaval, the 100 Years' War in its final throes, and the War of the Roses looming already. Chances aren't great that Jacqueline can get away with it, but they are definitely not zero. Whether she does or does not is what we're going to discuss next week. I hope you'll tune in again. And as usual, if you feel it is a worthwhile effort, make a contribution to the show at historyofthegermans.com/support.